Hey everyone, how's it going? This is another trip down memory lane for me, but it's for a game that I already talked about in the past. So it's not really a review this time around or anything, or, like it was before, but just casually talking about one of my favorite racing games of all time and one of my favorite games in the Need for Speed franchise, Need for Speed Underground 2. Revisiting Underground Rivals and finally getting 100% got me in the mood to revisit Underground 2 and, well, give myself reasons to talk about the game once more, which is something I don't often do on this channel, but I'm going to do it anyways. Need for Speed Underground 2 took the success of the first game and gave it a big open world on top of it to cruise around in, as well as doing races in it, as well as just vibing with the import tuner-centric world. As a kid, I spent countless hours customizing the rides, ricing the fuck out of them, adding whatever looked cool at the time, and adding neons onto them as well, which were an absolute must for each car. And each car had to live under my draconian rule to forever glow in the night with bright lights under the car. It had more to offer than the first game too, added what was already there and brought in new toys for the JDM nerds. It also continued the big shift that took the series in a new direction, steering away from the highway racing scene filled with sports cars and exotics, and instead opting for the Fast and Furious approach. This game was bedded in one of the best years we'd seen in gaming as well. A plethora of titles, including one of my all-time favorite GTAs, San Andreas. 2004 was one of the few Cinderella years where a lot of developers and studios locked in and cooked some of the best titles that still exist in some form today, and Need for Speed Underground 2 is one of them still. But it's also a game with a few problems in retrospect. Going back to older games as an adult hits different because of your developed perspective and, your expanded perception on things. I realized that looking back, I enjoyed this game a lot more as a kid because I didn't really know any better. It's easy to ignore a lot of the underlying issues when you're younger, and when you throw rages, you're usually blaming the game more often than piecing it together as to why things fucked up in the first place, or the technical issues that took place. As an adult, I can still see what's good and what's still bad about Underground 2 as a game. Customization is simultaneously amazing. It's some of the best in the older series, and somewhat frustrating because of its ties to the career progression. The open world is beautiful, it's varied and dynamic in its regions and areas that you can explore in, but it's also very tedious to drive from point A to point B, whether it's from, getting upgrades or going to a special event or just going to races in general. It's something that becomes a lot of work later on down the track. The career was somewhat weaker than the first game, the story wasn't as good, and the progression was a lot more annoying to get through because of how much work you had to do just to progress through the game, both in races and visual customization. I'm not the biggest drag fan, but somehow it's worse here than in 1. And once your money dries up, it's hard to find more money to keep buying shit unless you don't mind grinding outruns and getting that nice juicy $100 per race, or combing through all of the stage races in the world map. These are some of the problems I think about when playing Need for Speed Underground 2, and yet I still come back despite the nostalgia smell. And to be honest, whenever I think about both Underground 1 and 2, I usually lean more towards 2 because overall, it just has more to offer as a game. Performance tuning and aerodynamics, an open world to cruise in, drifting is much better here, car selection and customization is better. When I contrast 2 to 1, the main thing I could think of is that in 1, the career mode and the progression was a lot smoother and simpler and overall better. When I'm playing through the career modes of both games, 1 is a far better experience than 2, but when I can sit back and play with all of the toys after it's done, I think 2 is a better game. Open world racing back in the day was new for the Need for Speed series. The Midnight Club games were already doing it, but Need for Speed was more focused on course-based street races and a linear design. Need for Speed Underground 2 was a step into the open world space, which was both exciting and also somewhat tedious in its design. You couldn't just fast travel. This means that you could go from doing a downtown race to then having to go all the way up to Jackson Heights in the mountains just to do another event. What's worse too is that there are hidden races that you have to find to be able to 100%, and last time I checked, if you don't pick specific sponsors, you'll lock yourself out of a certain race or certain races and you won't be able to get 100%. This is due to a bug or a glitch that supposedly hasn't been fixed, and it's been a problem for a very long time. There's a reason people don't speedrun this game as much as the first game or even other Need for Speed titles, and it's because of how long and admittedly tedious this game is when you boil it down. While ricing was kind of a thing back in the day, adding as much shit as possible, it also made the amazing customization frustrating. Say if you're happy with the way your car looks, but your sponsor wants you to get magazines or DVD covers that requires a higher star rating. Well, guess what? That means upping the star rating, which means adding more shit to your car than what's necessary. There are 10 stars, and to get there, you have to produce cars that are more like abominations than something nice, clean, and sleek. As a kid, I liked adding all of the bells and whistles, but nowadays it's just awful to look at. However, when I just muck around in the arcade and just make whatever kind of car I want, or even roleplay and go with more low effort designs on purpose and not use NOS just to see if I can still win without it, that's when the customization really comes into its own stride. The game gave me so much, but I had to go through a lot of the game shit to finally get there, and that's one of the worst things about the game. Thankfully, there are mods that provide fast travel and even cancel the visual progression entirely, but as a vanilla product, these aspects just don't hold up very well for the game, and it's why some people prefer 1 over 2. What does hold up well is the driving experience and the customization options presented to you, even in spite of the problems regarding the visual progression, as well as the performance tuning system in general. It's not really something that you'll use if you're not really a gearhead or a car enthusiast, and to be honest, you don't really need it for general playthroughs anyway, but let me tell you, it certainly opens up a whole new dimension once you open yourself up to it. Say for instance you use an RX-7 for drifting and it's way too grippy and you can't get a good slide going. Well, try reducing the grip on the vehicle and see what happens. People have come up with their own presets that change the acceleration, top speed, and handling and steering of the cars in this game. To be honest, I still don't know what the fuck I'm doing with a lot of this stuff here, but I wanted more slide, I wanted less grip, so loosening it made the RX-7 work a lot better for drift events, and the best part is, you can tune the car for each type of race so you're not stuck to that one preset that you've made. It's the secret sauce to really getting the gist of this game's amazing handling system that carries over from 1. When it comes to the sense of speed, it's generally more of a feeling. However, some of the later Need for Speed titles like Shift 1 and 2, as well as Hot Pursuit 2010 that exhibit a much faster sense of speed, do it much better in that sense. 1 and 2 aren't too far apart from each other when it comes to the sense of speed, but I do feel a slight decrease in the sense of speed in 2. The only reason I could think that this possibly being the case is so that you weren't just zooming through the open world, that they put a lot of effort into crafting. In 1, the experience was more linear and could afford the breakneck speed since the focus was on racing more than anything else. 2's open world presence gives you more to appreciate than just the racing. You also have the driving experience and the world being your oyster. The sense of speed is altered, yes, but not to a great degree where it doesn't feel like I'm going fast. Like the Midnight Club games and Burnout and other older franchises, this is also a series that I can poke holes into and still enjoy them at the same time. They're not the same experiences I enjoyed as a kid anymore, but Underground 2 still manages to be a blast I can always return to and fuck around in. I don't get that excited for the career mode experience and the mandatory visual fuckery that you have to do to get ahead, but thankfully there are mods to mitigate that crap, and there's even mods like New Game X that gives you an entirely new and interesting experience to justify another playthrough of this game. Even without the mods though, there's stuff that makes me return to the setting of Bayview and take in the underground atmosphere that's still there. Getting into outrun events with random drivers throughout the mountains or the highways and having a blast doing it. It's still a really fun racing game with all of the variety of events that you can do, the types of races, the variety of cars that you have, the amazing customization. This game is still one of my favorites because of those things. I have memories hidden away in my brain with this game, but I do remember the white 350Z with the octopus vinyl, with the Atmosphere track from the group Atmosphere that never made it into the final product, and getting to experience a little of the game that would be Underground 2. The blue PS2 demo discs were a thing to behold back then, and was basically our version of early access to a game before the full release. We just called them demos. Driving through Jackson Heights, through the mountains, and just seeing the whole city in full view is an unforgettable experience. For a lot of its repetition and the career progression, it's amazing to cruise around once you're finally left to your devices. The car selection and the soundtracks in the Need for Speed series is a subjective matter, but here it's great, in my opinion anyways. The variety did get better over time with a more dynamic range of vehicles, but here in this game, it was dependent on whether you liked the import tuners to begin with. Even with the Audi cars, the Ford Mustang, or the SUVs, the alternatives were minimal in choice, so for people that didn't like JDMs, you didn't have a lot of options. For me, I loved the choice of cars, and having my Nissans in a racing game is also another draconian rule that I also enact if I had my own racing game. Or do what Midnight Club 2 did and make clones of those cars. In saying that, we did leave some cars behind unfortunately, like the Integra and the S2000, and it would have been nice to see them once more in Underground 2. When it comes to the soundtrack itself, I grew up with it and I still bang out those tunes from time to time. But when it comes to debating what soundtracks are better than the other, it's really just more of an opinion than anything else. Whenever people debate soundtracks that consist of licensed music, I usually just tune out because it's way too subjective as a topic and it usually just boils down to your personal tastes. The only thing I could say about the soundtracks in each of the games is how they fit into the game's world and setting. In this game's case, I feel like the tracks here have their place and reflect the 2000s racing scene here pretty well. Compositional tracks are one thing, but licensed music from various artists is another. People were shitting on Unbound's music, but that doesn't really mean anything to me at all because you could just as easily shit on any of the soundtracks from the older games if the music doesn't jive with your taste in the first place. And not just music, but also the games themselves. People shut on Underground back in the day and people shit on the recent titles, so hating in the Need for Speed community is nothing new. In fact, it's pretty much to be expected if you ever engage with the Need for Speed community. Underground 2 and even Underground 1 have their problems, and they ultimately do some things better than the other. But now that I've beaten the games multiple times, I'm also in a position to just return to them leisurely and just do whatever I want, or mod it for new and challenging experiences, which is what Underground 2 does way better than 1. Even in spite of its repetitive career mode progression, tedious traveling from one event to another, URL races being a slog, the shittier story, I ultimately have more reasons, despite all of that, to return to 2 whenever I want to go back in time. Need for Speed Underground 2 is still an amazing game, with or without the nostalgia smell. Thanks for watching.